A lone cowboy pulls into town atop his trusty steed, 6 shooters on his hip. He saunters into the nearest saloon and sits for a drink. The waitress gives the stranger a smile as she sets down his single shot of whiskey, and the stranger returns it. Suddenly, a man leaps to his feet, enraged and screaming, "Hey, that's my woman!" And in the span of a few heartbeats, the two strangers are facing each other down, 6 shooters drawn and ready to fire. Bar patrons flee for their lives, some to find the local sheriff, even though everyone knows that the only law around these parts is the law of the gun. There's few periods in human history more iconic or more full of myth and legend than America's Wild West. Many nations have had their own pioneering and expansion periods, but none have ever inspired the awe of America's western frontier. From rampaging Indians out for revenge on the settlers taking their land from them, to gangs of outlaws shooting up remote towns full of helpless villagers, the Wild West has been the subject of much myth and no small amount of exaggeration. But just how wild was the Wild West really? When you think Wild West, one of the first images that spring to mind is that of settlers in wagon trains crossing the prairies of Middle America, only to have a horde of angry Indians descending on them. It's a trope that's been told across novels, movies, and even comic books, with the Indians justified for their slaughter of pioneers as revenge in some and demonized as uncivilized savages in others. Yet the truth is far less dramatic. And while Native Americans and U.S. cavalry forces did clash on numerous occasions, typically with a very one-sided outcome for the cavalry, very few immigrants heading out west ever met their death at the end of a tomahawk. Between 1840 and 1860, there were only 362 cases of fatal Indian attacks on wagon trains, while in the same time period, between 10,000 and 30,000 pioneers died to disease, animal attack, and accident. On the flip side, there were 426 documented killings of Indians by settlers, with likely many more never being reported. The famous and iconic image of wagon trains circling in order to defend from Indian attack was actually meant to keep cattle from wandering away, rather than defend from an Indian attack that almost never came. In fact, it was the Indians who were the greater victims, as usual, with the great wagon trains moving across their land, chasing game away and using up wood supplies in the sparse prairie regions for their campfires. The settlers also brought disease with them, which would spread and remain long after the settlers had moved along. Indians were so affected by the passage of large wagon trains that they began to demand payment for passage across their lands, which naturally most settlers completely ignored and instead opted to arm themselves to the teeth and threaten reprisal if the Indians pressed them too hard on the matter. Valuable as guides across the mountains and dangerous terrain of the western U.S., Indians were more likely to be hired as guides than to form war bands to prey on unwary settlers. If there's one thing we can be sure of about the Wild West, is that it was a tough, lawless place that was home to more bank heists and robberies than rattlesnakes. Yet despite having been home to the most famous outlaws in history, the Wild West had surprisingly few bank robberies. In one 40-year period between 1860 and 1900, only between 7 and 9 bank robberies were recorded. By comparison, the U.S. had 4,251 bank robberies in total in 2016. That's 7 to 9 robberies in 40 years versus over 4,000 in just 1 year. The fact is, the Wild West was a safer place to bank than most modern nations today. But why were bank robberies so rare, given how remote most towns were and seemingly susceptible to criminal activity? First, there's the simple fact that in those days the more permanent buildings tended to be huddled together. That meant that a bank typically had a grocer on one side and the sheriff's office on the other. So if you decided to rob a bank, you'd have a very short walk to a waiting jail cell next door. Banks were also very robustly built to deter anyone from trying to dynamite their way in, though the noise would obviously give you away pretty quickly. And since most people slept and lived right above their establishments, not only would an angry banker be on you in seconds with his rifle, but the sheriff as well. It just wasn't practical or even realistic to rob a bank, which is why the famous bank robberies such as those done by Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were in fact so famous. The act of actually robbing a bank and getting away with it was such a legendary deed that it ironically created the legend of lawlessness in the Wild West. Okay, so criminals weren't running around rampant shooting and robbing everyone in sight, and Indians weren't constantly descending on wagon trains full of settlers heading west. Surely, if there's one thing about the Wild West that isn't a myth, it's the one thing it's most famous for. It's guns. The Wild West was the American frontier, a dangerous place full of wild animals and, well, not so many criminals or hostile Indians, it turns out. Still, as a frontier, it had its dangers, and to face those dangers, every man, woman, and child had to carry a gun on their hip or a rifle on their back. Sadly, for modern gun vendors and anyone against gun control who use the Wild West as an icon for their products and ideologies, the truth is that there was far more strict gun control in the Wild West than in modern America. The reasoning was simple: people were sick and tired of all the gun violence. Initially, the first groups of settlers came out west armed to the teeth, and when those heavily armed settlers started building communities, it's little surprise that gun violence skyrocketed. With gun violence endemic to daily life, citizens and politicians took action on gun control, banning the carrying of guns on a person's body and limiting their sale. In Colorado, cowboys were forbidden from carrying them as they herded cattle back and forth across their ranges. And in the infamous Dodge City, Kansas, authorities posted a large sign warning that the carrying of firearms was strictly forbidden. Go to a modern gun show and you'll see replicas of Wild West firearms along with plenty of iconography, meant to inspire gun ownership as an American frontier tradition. Yet the historical truth is that guns were seen as a barbaric relic of the past, as written in an editorial of the Caldwell commercial in 1882 Kansas. Not only was the Wild West home to strict gun control laws, but the most iconic moment of Wild West history, the duel at high noon, is yet another myth of the era that rarely, if ever, actually happened. Most six-shooters simply weren't accurate enough to fire at anything but extremely close ranges, which is why the shotguns and rifles were the preferred weapons of the day. Six-shooters, duels at high noon, Indian attacks, bank robberies, and gun control. Is there anything about the Wild West we haven't ruined for you in this episode? Sadly, the truth is that what has been glamorized as the wildest period in American history was anything but, and in our option should be renamed the Mild West for historical accuracy. With far more gun violence and bank robberies today, you were far safer in the Wild West than in most American cities right now. And in a century or two, we wouldn't be surprised to see our modern age made into the new Wild West for future generations. Though at least this time, it would be far more accurate. What other myths about the Wild West do you know of? Also, check out our video from our friend Simple History titled How to Survive the Wild West to learn more about the topic. See you next time.